What was initially billed as a light-hearted conversation between Prince Harry and Jon Stewart on The Daily Show quickly devolved into an unexpectedly tense and awkward exchange that exposed not only deep ideological differences but also the delicate balance between celebrity activism and journalistic comedy, as Prince Harry, long attempting to redefine his public image beyond the British monarchy and into a more global, independent identity, found himself up against Stewart's sharp wit, piercing commentary, and a probing insistence on substance over sentiment, which, while often welcomed by other guests, seemed to strike a particularly raw nerve with the Duke of Sussex. The segment began innocuously enough, with the two men exchanging pleasantries about Harry's recent charitable endeavors, his memoir's global impact, and the intense scrutiny that continues to follow him and Meghan Markle wherever they go. But the moment Stewart subtly pivoted to critique, not Harry's causes but the way in which the prince had leveraged his royal identity to simultaneously reject and profit from the institution he claimed to despise, the temperature on set shifted dramatically, and viewers who had tuned in expecting laughs were instead drawn into an increasingly uncomfortable back and forth that left even Stewart's seasoned writing team stunned. When Stewart quipped, "It's a bit like resigning from a job you hated but still using the company name on your resume," it was clearly meant as satire, but Harry, visibly annoyed, shot back with a curt, "That's not only reductive, it's dismissive of everything I've been trying to build." And while Stewart tried to recover by acknowledging the difficulty of Harry's position, he continued pressing, asking if the prince's newfound freedom from the monarchy had really resulted in the kind of impact he hoped for, or if he had merely traded one spotlight for another, this time curated through Netflix deals, podcast appearances, and highly choreographed interviews. Harry, growing more defensive, attempted to reframe the narrative, explaining that his intent was to use his platform to shed light on mental health, veterans' issues, and systemic media abuse, but Stewart, refusing to be mollified, pressed again. "But does the message get lost when the messenger is always on the cover of Vanity Fair?" A line that visibly struck a nerve and prompted Harry to push back, arguing that raising awareness required visibility, and that criticism often ignored the personal costs he and his family had paid, not to mention the institutional resistance they'd faced. The audience, caught between discomfort and intrigue, sat in near silence as Stewart, maintaining his trademark balance of civility and satire, acknowledged Harry's trauma but questioned the consistency of his public role, noting that Harry's disavowal of press intrusion often conflicted with the curated media strategy his team employed, including exclusive interviews, controlled documentaries, and timed leaks that mirrored the very royal machine he had once condemned. At that point, Harry leaned forward, visibly frustrated, and declared, "You can't understand what it's like unless you've lived it," to which Stewart, calm but pointed, replied, "You're right, but isn't that the very thing people feel when you speak for causes you haven't personally endured either?" The statement landed like a thud, not because it was cruel, but because it undercut the moral authority Harry had worked so hard to construct, and the conversation, now no longer a conversation but a confrontation, teetered on the edge of implosion. With mounting tension and little sign of reprieve, Harry abruptly removed his earpiece, stood up, and with a sharp, "I came here for a discussion, not a cross-examination," exited the set, leaving Stewart and the audience in stunned silence, unsure whether to applaud, sympathize, or simply absorb the surreal moment unfolding before them. The production team, caught off guard, cut to commercial prematurely, and by the time they returned, Stewart, ever the professional, addressed the walk-off with a mix of humor and seriousness, saying, "Well, that escalated faster than a royal family reunion, but the moment had already transcended entertainment and entered the realm of cultural spectacle." Within hours, social media lit up with clips, commentary, and hastily posted think pieces, some defending Harry's decision to leave and condemning Stewart for ambushing his guest, while others praised the host for holding powerful public figures accountable regardless of their tragic backstory or tabloid treatment. Political commentators joined the fray, with British outlets gloating over the prince's unraveling on American TV and American pundits split between those tired of the Sussex narrative and those who believed the royal family had orchestrated Harry's fall from grace and he was still recovering in real time. Meghan Markle issued no statement, nor did Harry's press team, but insiders leaked that the prince had felt blindsided by the direction of the interview, believing he had been invited to discuss humanitarian efforts rather than defend his past, while Stewart's team pushed back by releasing an unedited transcript of the pre-interview notes, clearly showing that no subject was off-limits and Harry's representatives had signed off on all talking points. The conversation turned toward broader debates about public vulnerability, media accountability, and whether famous figures, especially those from powerful families, should be treated differently when they embrace activist roles. Mental health advocates expressed concern that the confrontation could be re-traumatizing for Harry, while others argued that the media couldn't tiptoe around public figures just because they had suffered, especially if they were building brands off that suffering. Despite the polarizing fallout, Stewart's ratings surged temporarily, his interview style lauded by some as vintage Daily Show journalism, and criticized by others as performative ambush comedy, but Stewart himself took a more introspective tone in later episodes, noting that the line between respectful critique and harsh confrontation can be difficult to navigate, especially with guests who carried personal trauma into public life. Meanwhile, Harry laid low, canceling a few public appearances and opting for more controlled environments in the weeks that followed, including a virtual summit on trauma and healing where he briefly alluded to the incident by saying, "Not all conversations happen the way we want, but they can still reveal what we need to learn," a line many interpreted as both a critique and an acceptance of what transpired on Stewart's show. What remained, however, was a persistent unease in the public discourse, about authenticity, power, privilege, and the tension between owning one's narrative and being challenged on it. Ultimately, the walk-off didn't destroy Harry's public image, nor did it cement Stewart as a villain or hero. It did, however, reveal the limits of controlled storytelling in a world increasingly allergic to contradictions, and where sincerity, when exposed to scrutiny, either deepens or dissolves depending on how it's held. And as with many such viral moments, the spectacle eventually faded, but the questions it raised continued to echo in interviews, roundtables, and editorial columns long after the cameras stopped rolling. In the days following Prince Harry's abrupt walk-off from The Daily Show, the reverberations of that single moment of televised tension continued to unfold in unpredictable ways, turning what could have been a brief news cycle blip into a broader cultural referendum on accountability, trauma, celebrity, and the complicated expectations placed on individuals who straddle the line between royalty and activist, public figure and private survivor, with Harry's silence fueling speculation, interpretation, and in some corners, backlash, while Jon Stewart, ever the tactician of reflective media critique, used the days that followed to recalibrate not just his own position in the discourse but the very format of his platform, openly acknowledging in interviews and podcast appearances that while his exchange with Harry had been unplanned in its emotional intensity, it nonetheless reflected a core tension that the public deserved to confront. Can someone both reject a system and still benefit from it without being questioned, and more importantly, can questioning someone's motives coexist with genuine respect for their personal pain? As headlines ricocheted between tabloids and highbrow think pieces, the moment took on mythological proportions, with every facial expression, gesture, and sentence deconstructed frame by frame on TikTok, YouTube breakdowns amassing millions of views dissecting whether Stewart had crossed a line or if Harry had simply been unprepared for unscripted honesty, while others debated whether this public rupture marked a critical turning point in the media's relationship with the Sussexes, a rupture that symbolized a loss of narrative control in an era obsessed with image curation. While neither party publicly attacked the other, the silence from Harry's camp became as loud as Stewart's measured reflections, with former palace aides, now media contributors, jumping at the chance to draw parallels between Harry's discomfort with scrutiny and his past criticisms of royal institutions, painting him as someone who welcomed tough conversations only when he controlled the microphone, a narrative that gained momentum as older clips of Harry speaking with fawning interviewers were contrasted with the more tense, interrogative tone of Stewart's approach. Within mental health communities, there was a growing rift as well. Some praised Harry's vulnerability as a symbol of breaking stigmas around masculinity and trauma, while others critiqued what they saw as a troubling reliance on curated narratives that shielded him from confronting inconsistencies in his messaging, particularly around his media strategy and the blurred lines between advocacy and branding. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, UK-based media outlets seized on the fallout to reignite public criticism of Harry and Meghan, using the walk-off as supposed proof that the couple was unraveling under the weight of their own contradictions, despite no substantive evidence of crisis, only the very human reality of conflict playing out in real time. Yet for all the commentary, the most fascinating transformation occurred in how The Daily Show began reimagining itself in response to the moment, with Stewart leading a special one-hour post-mortem episode titled When Interviews Get Too Real, in which he spoke candidly with media scholars, trauma experts, and even fellow comedians about the responsibilities of interviewers when navigating conversations with figures whose identities are wrapped in public trauma, asking whether emotional safety and journalistic integrity could truly coexist without compromise, and if not, who should bear the burden of that tension, the guest, the host, or the audience expecting both truth and tact. The episode drew record viewership, not because of its entertainment value, but because it dared to question the mechanics of modern fame, forcing a reckoning not just about how media engages trauma, but how audiences consume it, reward it, or weaponize it when a public figure stumbles outside of their pre-approved narrative lane. Harry, for his part, eventually re-emerged, not in a media blitz but through a quiet essay published in a lesser-known but respected psychological journal, where he shared reflections on vulnerability and the unexpected triggers that arise when trauma becomes content, writing with a rawness that reminded readers why his voice had once carried such transformative potential, even if that potential was now in flux. And though he didn't name Stewart directly, the essay's subtext was unmistakable, a call for compassion not just in storytelling but in the spaces where story meets interrogation. The essay was met with a mix of admiration and renewed scrutiny, some praising his courage in addressing the event obliquely without defensiveness, others suggesting that he was still evading the heart of the critique, namely, that his post-royal journey remained rife with contradictions between message and medium, something that could not be resolved through introspective prose alone. Nevertheless, his words sparked a renewed dialogue around how we hold space for flawed growth in the public eye, especially for figures burdened by legacies not entirely of their own making, and for all the division the incident had caused. There emerged a rare consensus that both Harry and Stewart had, in different ways, illuminated the complex realities of public healing, Harry by embodying it, and Stewart by exposing its limits. In the months that followed, the relationship between the two remained distant but not hostile, with quiet overtures of mutual respect circulating behind the scenes, emails exchanged through representatives, invitations declined politely, a sense that the moment, while painful, had also been productive, serving as a boundary that clarified values rather than a feud that calcified egos. Cultural commentators began referring to the incident as a watershed in modern media, a turning point when celebrity activism was forced to reckon with the unpredictability of unscripted honesty, and where talk show television, long a domain of pre-approved talking points and polished anecdotes, once again became a battleground for ideological vulnerability. Podcasts began unpacking it in serialized form. Roundtable panels analyzed it alongside other high-profile interview controversies, and journalism schools began including it in coursework under modules titled Public Narrative and Private Pain, or The Ethics of Televised Vulnerability, while media watchdogs praised The Daily Show for resisting the urge to spin the moment into caricature and instead embracing the messiness of what had transpired. And as for Harry, while he never returned to Stewart's show, he did begin appearing in more moderated, long-form conversations where the focus was less on performance and more on nuance, often recorded privately and released later, allowing him the space to refine his thoughts without the pressure of live confrontation. And though some accused him of hiding behind edited formats, others appreciated the depth these quieter platforms allowed him to access, creating a kind of post-television evolution of his public persona, less polished, more thoughtful, still controversial but increasingly grounded. Ultimately, the moment on Stewart's show did not define Harry's downfall, nor Stewart's victory. It became something rarer, a mirror, held up in real time, reflecting the deep contradictions and human vulnerabilities we so often ignore in the rush to create heroes or villains from those brave or foolish enough to speak unguardedly before millions. And while the media cycle eventually moved on to other scandals, the ghost of that conversation lingered in the collective consciousness, reminding us that even in a world of curated authenticity, real friction can still cut through the noise, and when it does, it reveals not just the fault lines in a guest or host, but in the very culture that demands perfection from people who are still, above all, just people.